Welcome. Today I'm going to tie a classic bucktail streamer pattern called the Mickey fin. This pattern's been around, I think, since the 1930s, maybe 1940s, and it is a standard trout fly. You don't see it sold in too many shops these days, but it's a classic pattern that is done very, very well for trout, and it fishes very well for bass, both largemouth and smallmouth. It has a number of interesting techniques to it that we're going to incorporate in the fly when we tie this today. So let's get started. We're going to put our hook in the vise. The Mickey fin is traditionally tied on a 4 to 5X long streamer hook. This is a Mustad R75. The previous model number was a 79580. It's a 5X long streamer hook. You can also tie these on very, very long 10X, 9X long. I think it's a Mustad R79 or like a Carrie Stevens hook or something like that for a real long kind of Mickey fin. But traditionally they're just on a little bit longer streamer hook than, say, a woolly bugger or something like that. I'm going to start with some 210 Denier FlyMasters Plus in black, and I'm going to attach that on the hook shank right here, right at the start of the point of the hook, and I'm just going to wrap a few wraps down to secure the thread along the hook shank. Then I'm going to tie in, I'm using for a rib, this is a Danville size 10 silver oval tinsel, and I'm going to tie this in such that the tip of the tinsel on this end just goes into the head space of the resulting head of the fly. That way, when that's lashed down along the hook shank, we'll have a nice smooth body and we won't have any bumps that will translate up into the body of the fly. 4 or 5 wraps to wrap that down just to get to the end of the shank, and then I'm going to start wrapping back up the hook shank in touching turns just to keep this nice and smooth. Don't put too much tension on your thread as you're wrapping around, and just collect the tinsel, the oval tinsel, along the hook shank here. If it starts to move around to the other side, stop, push it back up this way. You don't want it to wrap around the hook shank, because then when we put in the body material, you'll end up with a kind of a spiral inside the body, and you want the body to be nice and smooth. So once that's lashed down, I'm going to bring my thread to just off the end, or just on the end, I should say, of the tinsel there. We're going to tie in our body material. The body material for this is a Danville number 10 Mylar tinsel. It's gold on one side, silver on the other side, and we're going to tie this in right at the front of the hook, and then wrap down the end of the shank and then back up. In order to tie this in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one end of it here, and I'm going to cut this at a real steep angle like this. And I'm going to tie it on my side of the hook shank right here with that point right there, just right at the end, or at the end of the Mylar tinsel, the oval tinsel. And I'm going to put a few wraps to secure that in. I don't want to wrap down too far, because this is going to be the head space right here where the head of the fly is, and all of this is going to be the body. But by tying it in with that little corner right there, what that does is I can, when I go to wrap this in and flip it over to the silver side, it's going to minimize how much of a bump I'm going to end up with right here. Because we want this to be a nice smooth body and everything, we have to keep in mind these little things like when that Mylar's folded over, it's going to put a bump in there. And that's just one way. There are other ways that you could attach that Mylar for the body, but that's how I'm doing it. I'm going to put just a real thin coat of head cement right along the hook shank here, and this is, or I should say along those threads, this is just to bind the Mylar, the base coat of Mylar, to the hook shank a little bit and help secure it a little bit more, especially while I'm tying it. I'm going to wrap this forward. It flips over to the silver side, and now I'm going to keep wrapping this forward in touching turns. If I have to err on some side of not getting a touching turn. I want a little bit of a gap just to have some thread showing through. I don't want to overlap these, because if I do, then I end up with a little bit of a ridge where the Mylar overlaps, and that will actually show up in the body, especially when we wrap it back forward. So I'd rather have just a little gap there. I'm going to work my way down to the end of the shank here. Just take your time. If needed, when you come around and have to navigate the point of the hook, just put your finger right up there to hold that in place. And once you get all of that, wrapped in there, there we go. Back at the end, we're going to start going the other direction. Now this is where this top layer of Mylar is going to cover up any of those spaces that had thread throwing showing through. Getting tongue-tied there. And we'll end up with a nice silver body. You want to try and have touching turns on that as well. Once I get up to where I tied it in, I'm going to put 3 or 4 wraps to secure the Mylar in. And be very careful that you do not lose thread tension right here at this end at any point in the next few steps, because once we cut that Mylar off like that, if I lose thread tension and this scoots out from underneath the thread wraps, all of that's going to come unwrapped. Nothing you can do but just go back to the beginning of the Mylar and start over again. So I'm going to put in a few wraps here moving towards the eye of the hook, and at this point I'm going to move my bobbin cradle in, and I'm going to use the rotary features of my hook, or excuse me, my vise here. I'm going to put 7 to 8 wraps of the tinsel, oval tinsel in the rib as I work my way up to the head of the fly. One thing you want to be careful of, you don't want to have that last wrap that you put in to be up inside the head space here like this. I have it to where it's just coming around the bottom like that, and it's just on my side of the hook right here, and that's perfect, because when I lash this in, I can pull that to my side a little bit. I lash that in, I can get a nice smooth platform for the bucktail that I'm going to tie in. If this were wrapped in too close up in here, the bucktail would actually be pulled down against it like this, and it would tend to flare the bucktail out. So we'll cut that tinsel off. And that is our body and rib. At this point, I'm going to change my thread. The reason I use the FlyMasters Plus 210 here is simply because I can move from this end of the hook shank to this end much quicker than if I used, say, the 70 Denier or something a little bit smaller. Some people like to use the heavier thread when they're putting the bucktail in. I find that I end up, the clumps of bucktail aren't that big that I can't use a lighter thread like a 70 Denier. But if I use this, I end up getting too bulky of a head because I've got too many thread wraps in there to try and get it all secured in and get the shape that I want. So I'm going to use a 70 Denier Wapsi UTC black, and I'm going to attach it right here behind the eye of the hook, and I'm just going to advance it down the hook shank to right where my thread, my original thread is, and I'm just going to cut that off, that and the tag. I'll then move this down a little bit. My head space for this fly is going to be about 1 eye length to 1.5 eye lengths behind the eye of the hook. Okay, so we want to tidy this up just a little bit to make certain that I have a nice smooth platform for tying in the bucktail. We're going to tie in the bucktail at this point, and we want to make certain that our initial clump of yellow bucktail is going to be very, very sparse, because the red bucktail that we're going to put in on top is going to be the same size as that initial yellow clump of bucktail. And then the yellow bucktail that goes on top of the red is going to be the same size as both the yellow and the red. So if this is too thick, then the rest of the wing is going to get much, much thicker as we go, and eventually it's going to be a little bit too much. So I cut mine very, very sparse. You're going to cut your bucktail off and clean it, and you can stack it if you want. Don't get too concerned about the tips being nice and perfectly even. Actually, they're better off just being a little bit ragged. So I'm going to put this on the hook shank, and I want the tips to at least be to the bend. I prefer to have them stick out maybe a quarter to half of a hook shank past the bend, and then we're going to lash these down to the hook. Be careful that you don't wrap any further back down the hook shank. We don't want to make the head any bigger than it needs to be. And put in just enough wraps to hold that in place. I'm going to wrap forward here towards the eye just to tidy that up a little bit. It's going to be a lot easier when I make the finished head of the fly if I have some of this lashed down right behind the eye of the hook. Our red bucktail is going to be the same size as the clump of bucktail, the yellow that we already tied in, and you're going to prep it in the same way. You're going to put it right on top here with the tips just as even with the yellow. You're going to bind that in on the hook shank, wrap it in. You take a few wraps, and if need to, collect those. You want to make certain that the hairs aren't going around to the sides of the hook at all, simply because we want to keep them all right up on, nice and neat up on top. There we go. Once that's tied in the way you like it, I wouldn't really worry about that flaring too much. The yellow's going to push down on that. We can put a few wraps back here, light ones, just to collect those. Then we'll cut this off. And again, I'm going to wrap forward, collecting those down to the hook shank, and that's just going to make it easier for us to make the head in just a moment when we're ready for the last clump of bucktail. My last clump of bucktail is going to be the same thickness as both the yellow and the red that was just put in. Same thing, you're going to cut this out and you're going to stack it, but I wouldn't worry too much if you got a few hairs that are a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. You can cull those out if you want, but if the ends aren't nice and smooth and neat, that's fine. I'm going to put that right on top of the red, holding that in place. I'm going to tie that in. And here again, this is more hair, so you want to make certain that this is not wrapping down around the hook shank and covering everything up. The idea is that when the fly is done, you have a nice strip of red right here that's sandwiched between the yellow below and the yellow above. And as you can see, the head of this fly, a lot of your bucktail streamers, the heads tend to be a little bit bigger. Again, these aren't your delicate little trout flies, I should say, like dry flies and nymphs, where you just have a nice little nose to it. There's a lot of hair in there, so the head's going to be a little bit bulkier. You want to try and minimize that as much as we can during the process here. I'm going to cut these a little bit in front of my thread wraps because these are all going to get wrapped down right behind the eye of the hook. I'm going to work my way to the eye of the hook and then start wrapping backwards. This is to create the head of the fly. I find that a lot of times these streamers the heads have more of a squared off nose on them because you're trying to cover up all those thread wraps, you're trying to cover up all of those butt ends of bucktail. Another reason why I like to use a smaller Denier thread, the 70 Denier, because if I do this with a large thread, it really gets kind of big. So once I get that tied in and everything is covered up from both sides, I don't have to put more wraps in it. That looks good. Then I can go ahead and do a 5 or 6 turn whip finish. and the head of the fly is done. If needed, you can massage a little bit some of this bucktail to get it. You want to make certain it's all nice in line. I really wouldn't worry about it too much. You're going to throw this in the water, and the first fish that comes along and nails this is going to start messing it up anyway. So, but that's a good looking Mickey fin right there. I'm going to take my thin head cement here, and I'm going to put some down on the base of the hairs to soak down into them and into the head, and I'm going to let that dry. In a few minutes that will be dry, and there's one more step that I like to do. You don't have to if you don't want to, but as soon as that's dry, I'll show you. So the head cement that I put on there is dry by now, and you can probably see I get a little bit of a white residue on the outside of the fly. It's not head cement. What that actually is, the head cement that I use is called Fly-Tite, and it is an alcohol-based head cement. What I think it does is the head cement dissolves some of the wax that's on the thread, and then once it soaks in and it dries away, that wax is just left on top. There's a couple things you could do. You could use a UV resin on top of that if you want to just coat over that, or even a traditional lacquer head cement just to put a top coat on that. I like to use a product called Hard as Hull. It is just a nice top coat. It looks, when you put it on here, like it's very, very thick, but what it will do is actually cure, or I should say dry, and when it does, it shrinks down. So you don't get like a built-up gloss head, even though as you're putting it on here, it looks like that's what it's going to be. It isn't. You'll see the thread wraps and everything. But at least you won't have that wax sitting on the top of it. And at the same time, if you don't want to do that, you certainly don't have to do that on your flies. This is what this particular fly has, the Hard as Hull all dry on it. As you can see, that first coat, you can see some of the thread wraps and things in it, but it looks a little bit nicer. That wax, or that white kind of powdery look to it, isn't going to affect it when you throw it in the water in terms of fishing it, but at the same time, there's something to be said for having a nice looking fly. If you want to, you can take the Hard as Hull and put 3 to 4 coats on there, and it will build up, and you'll end up with what looks like a really, really nice lacquered head like this right here. But it takes 3 or 4 coats to do it, maybe about 5 minutes to dry between coats. That's up to you. So that's the Mickey fin. It's a very, very fun fly to tie. It is considered a classic bucktail streamer fly. Fantastic trout fly. It does very, very well for largemouth and even smallmouth bass. It's just a lot of fun. There's a lot of wonderful techniques in tying this fly that you use in all kinds of other fly tying, and it has its own challenges with that wing being comprised of different amounts of bucktail and trying to keep it so that it doesn't get too unwieldy. Thank you for joining me today while I tied the Mickey fin. It's a classic bucktail streamer pattern that's a lot of fun to tie and even more fun to fish. I hope you found this informative and educational, and I have some other videos on my channel, fly tying, that I hope you enjoy. If you have any questions about this fly or any other flies in any of my videos, feel free to leave a comment or question down below, and I will respond to them and answer any questions that you have in any way that I can help you with your own fly tying. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and hit that notification icon so that you get notified every week when we put out new videos. And always remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.